and you did not hear. Now, this is important because this word, akuo, in the Greek, is a synonym for the Hebrew lishmoa. We've talked about this word. It means not just to listen or hear, but it means to hear and respond. So what this one is saying to this group of people is, I've told you, but you haven't responded. Now they're asking him again, and that's in the text, a second time. And what does he conclude? Well, are you asking me this a second time? Do you want to hear it again? Why? Are you ready to be his disciples? That's what he says in verse 27. Do you not also want to be his disciples? And look at their response, verse 28. Now, verse 28 has a very strong word at the beginning of the sentence. It means to have utter and total contempt. It means to simply speak in a shameful way to cause others to think that you are shameful. And that's what they were trying to do. So they responded with contempt to this man, and they said, you are that one's disciple. Now remember, earlier on, we see that the blind man who now sees is called by that same demonstrative pronoun, that one. And now Yeshua in this passage is being called by that same word, that one. And why? Well, we talked about it a few weeks ago. It is to show a connection between them, an intimacy, a relationship between them. So they say, you are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses. Now here's the problem. If you truly understand the revelation of Moses, you are going to be put in a position spiritually. You are going to be revealed that Yeshua is indeed the Messiah. In other words, this: the more that someone understands the Torah, they are going to be in a better position to discern the identity and the work of Messiah. No, we've already talked about, even though they spoke often about the law of Moses, what they were following was the traditions of the elders. So they say, you are his disciples, but we are Moses' disciples. Look at verse 29. For we know that God spoke to Moses, but this one we do not know from where he is. Now, that statement in this passage is key. It is emphatic in the text. It's being emphasized. Why? Well, here was the view in that day. It was viewed that the smarter that someone is in the Scripture, the more that someone has spiritual knowledge, that would also put them in a position where they could what? Do powerful deeds. And where did one get this spiritual knowledge? Well, from the leadership. That was the view. So someone would have to come up through the ranks. And they're saying to this one, concerning Yeshua, that he's done this great act. Remember, no one has ever healed one who was born blind. That act is reserved for the Messiah. And they're saying, we don't know where he's from. That is, we don't understand the origin of this one. And notice how this blind man who now sees responds. He says, look at it. He answers this man and said to them, for in this is a marvelous thing. Now, why does he say this is marvelous? Well, what he's saying is, it's almost shocking that someone could do such a miracle as this, and you not know him, that he has been raised up in your teaching, your training. You have no identity where he's from, and therefore this man gets it right. He says, and you did not know where he is, and he opened my eyes. Verse 31. But we know that a sinner God does not hear, but those who worship him and wants to do his will, this one he hears. Now who's speaking? Once again, this blind man who now sees. He is speaking spiritual truth. Why? Well, here's what the Scripture is trying to reveal to us. The thought in that day and age was exactly like the disciples thought. Someone born blind, sin is in his life. His sin, his parents' sin, he comes from a bad line of people. He is accursed. And therefore, he doesn't know anything. He is deluded. He is absent of the things of God. And what's happening? Well, this one who was blind, he couldn't see, but you know what he could do? Hear. He could listen. And he picked up through hearing some spiritual truth. And that is what they were saying. If one does a great miracle, he must have great knowledge. He must have studied much. And the fact that these leaders don't know where Yeshua is from, well, he sees great significance in that. That he was still able to open up the eyes of the blind. And therefore, notice here he says, we know something. We know that if someone worships God and wants to do His will, God hears him. He's saying, this is how my eyes were opened up. Remember the question going back to verse 26, when the leadership said, what did he do to you? Well, this blind man is teaching them. He's saying, here's how it came about. This one must worship God. That is, he must have an intimate relationship with the living God. And he must desire to do His will, His Father's will, because if someone wants to do God's will, God hears him. And so he's saying these things. And what happens? Well, it says at the end of verse 32, it says, and we know, no one has ever been able to open up the eyes of a blind man who was born blind. And he says, if this man was not from God, he would not be able to do nothing. So this blind man is perfectly testifying in regard to what Yeshua has done. And not just what Yeshua has done, but who Yeshua is. That He is someone who worships God. Someone who desires to do God's will. And someone whom God listens to. And that's how this miracle came about. Now, before we go any further, we need to underscore this principle. And that's what? If we worship God and we desire to do His will, now those are not two things. They're really the same thing expressed in two different ways. You see, worshiping God is His will. And when we worship God, we're going to what? Be positioned to express His will through our life, in deeds, in acts of obedience. Worship positions us where we can obey God. So it's not, well, I worship and then I stop worshiping and I go out and I serve God. No, they're one and the same. Two different expressions, but the outcome is the same. And what is that? God is being glorified. Whether it's through acts of worship and praise and adoration or through deeds, the connection is a desire to honor Him. And worship is the best preparation for acts of obedience. So this one says in this passage of Scripture, we know if someone desires to worship God and to do His will, He hears him. And here's the evidence of it. No one has ever been healed from being born blind, ever. Something unique is going on here. Now look at verse 34. He says previously, no sinful man is able to do an act such as this. But they answered, verse 34, and said to him, in sins you were conceived totally. Now, we don't want to miss out on the literalness of this sentence. What is said here is this. What do? They do not criticize His words. They criticize Him. They can't attack the truth of what He said. So they attacked Him. And they said, you were conceived, you were born in sin. And they used the Greek word holos, which is, we've heard of holistic. is where we get the word hold or